Long Voyage Back, page 232. Frank lay on his berth staring up at the white overhead, where the reflection of sunlight off the water danced like cold white fire. He'd gone to sleep about half an hour after coming off watch at 6 that morning, and he figured he must be getting close to noon. He didn't feel rested, he felt bone tired. There was a dull ache in his lower back that had been bothering him off and on for the last several days. His belly ached. An occasional wave of nausea swept over him like a pestilent fog. He wanted the voyage to be over. He loved Vagabond and was completely at home on her, but his ship, like the rest of life, was slipping out of his control. As long as he owned her, 3 years now, he loved her partly because she was his creation and his to control. Now she was no longer his. She belonged to everyone who needed her. If he didn't like to see Skippy's comic books lying around, or Jim taking over half his cabin or playing his guitar up on the foredeck, or Neil always sitting or standing around the wheelhouse if it was his personal command post, he was no longer free to say so. It was their boat too. If he tried to have everything run to please him, everyone else would be miserable. So instead, he had to be miserable. Vagabond was getting junky. No matter how often he and Neil spoke about it, no one ever seemed to clean the blood and fish scales from the side cockpits, ever remembered to pick up the lures, and the leaders and line that always seemed to be lying around. The wheelhouse was always cluttered with comic books, towels, paper cups, books, bits of food, or somebody else's shirt and socks. Bullet holes in the plexiglass. The after wall was now a sail. The blankets and sheets were starting to stink. Jean and Katia kept the galley and dinette in good shape when they were around, but at other times Ollie, Tony and Jim left little messes. Neil and Macklin were neat, he supposed, but Neil didn't seem to be trying to control the others. And he hated the way Neil made all the decisions about even the pretense of consulting him. He felt like a passenger on his own boat. He knew he didn't have Neil's experience or instincts, but he knew his boat and handled her more often than Neil had, and resented being shunted aside. He felt he had the right at any time to override any of Neil's decisions, but hadn't yet found the issue that was right for reasserting his control. Neil didn't even seem to be aware of the ways he was ignoring his skills, advice and rights as owner. And Neil seemed to be flirting with Jean. Jean. There was the fucking rub. Frank wanted her closeness, needed her closeness to protect him from the shocks that were coming at him from all directions. Felt that she needed his closeness and comfort. But suddenly, out of nowhere, there was Neil. He himself had known Jean since before Skippy's birth, and in the past few years had become damn fond of her. It wasn't so much sexual attraction, except on occasion just a strong feeling of warmth, affection, longing even, and he had found hard to express to her, which he felt she sensed. Shit, maybe he was in love with her, and had been for a couple of years. And now Bob was dead, and he needed her, and suddenly there was Neil. It wasn't fair. He rolled from his back onto his stomach and wrestled angrily with the pillow. When he finally told Jean of his feelings 2 nights before, he'd felt subtly rejected. She'd admitted that she'd sensed his affection and appreciated it, and said she had admired him over the last year for not creating conflict for her by approaching her overtly and forcing her to respond. She seemed to think it was okay now for him to express his feelings, but wasn't at all sure about herself. Events had moved so fast that she didn't think she could depend on any of her emotional responses. But now he wondered if it was all just bullshit to cover up the fact she was turned on by Neil. Turned on. Jesus, that phrase made him sick. His feelings for Jean went far beyond just being turned on. So Neil was younger, and had muscles like a gymnast, and always stood around looking like Patton in his underwear. What kind of relationship could you have based on that? What could he do about it? What could he do about anything? Vagabond hissed and plunged forward as if she were an independent creature fleeing from herself southward through the sea. He and Neil her obedient servants. Would Puerto Rico solve his problems? Neil's getting press gang back into the Navy would certainly have solved one problem, but even the idea of Neil's leaving him saddened him. Although Neil had become self-absorbed lately, normally he was the only one he'd ever sailed with who'd appreciate Vagabond the way he did, could communicate with a glance what a blast it was sizzling along at 13 knots or swinging an anchor in a squall. But even sailing these last few days didn't inspire him with enthusiasm. Nothing did. A part of him felt he was dying and he needed someone to talk to, but she always seemed too busy. He felt lonely and alone. His 2 best people, Jean and Neil, beginning to sail away from him on a different tact. He wanted to alter course, stay with them, But in the nightmare world he was inhabiting, he couldn't find the sheets, or finding them had no sense of whether they should be pulled in or eased. Rudderless, his life raced through the night, and he, its captain, no longer knew his position or his course. He was lost, and his fucking back ached, and he wanted to puke, and it was noon, his and Tony's watch again. The nice thing about Neil's insisting on a tight, rigidly maintained watch schedule was that every 6 or 8 hours it forced you to stop thinking and act. Frank pushed himself heavily up off the berth and lowered his feet to the floor. Action. Action. Slowly, painfully, he began putting on his boat shoes. That night in the forepeak, Jim and Lisa finally found the place and time to make love. Ollie and Macklin were on watch, and Tony, who had also had a berth forward, was talking with Katia up in the wheelhouse. The others were asleep in their cabins. For Jim and Lisa, it was the only place they could find to be alone. The motion of Vagabond into and over the swells alternatively accented and interfered with the motions of their lovemaking in ways that made Jim and Lisa giggle. Everything, even their awkwardness, was a delight. The few couplings Jim had known, burdened with the pressure of performance and the absence of love, hadn't prepared him for the unexpected joy of being with Lisa, who, inexpert, shy and passive, made him feel his every touch was a miracle of perfection. When he first entered her, it had been painful for her. His first climax a disappointingly minor event, soon forgotten in the midst of rising pleasure and the excitement of the continuing play of their hands and lips and words. They were naked and sweating, suppressing their noises and giggles, and enraptured with the discovery of so much happiness. When Jim had climaxed a second time, they lay side by side facing each other, grinning, laughing, trying half-heartedly to raise their conversation above the level of the idiotic. "You did too, Squeal," Lisa insisted, "and it was nice." Jim shook his head, smiling. "I didn't hear a thing." "Do I make noises?" Lisa asked. "I was too busy to notice." Again they laughed until a noise behind the curtain reminded them that they were only a few feet away from the main cabin. They lay quietly, staring at each other, listening. They heard Tony swear and Katia laugh. "Do you think they might come in here?" Lisa asked. Jim grimaced and nodded. "They might," he said. "Should we let people know?" Lisa asked. "You know, about what we're doing." "No," said Jim. "Our parents have enough to worry about without—" "Oh, I know," said Lisa. "After Frank and Mum had that long talk after dinner last night, I found her crying in her cabin." "Really?" "I don't understand what's happening with them all. Do you? I think—" Katia abruptly ducked beneath the curtain and poked her head up only a few feet away. "Oh!" Katia said. "Hey, I'm sorry. I must have the wrong room." She laughed briefly and just as quickly stooped down to disappear behind the curtain. As they heard Katia and Tony begin arguing, Jim grabbed his swimming trunks and pulled them on, and Lisa scrambled for her shorts and blouse. "What is this?" Tony said, suddenly pushing past the curtain. "Neil gives me the worst berth on the boat, and even then it's not mine." "I'm sorry," Jim whispering. "Would you please keep your voice down?" "I can't even talk in my own cabin," said Tony. "Oh, shut up," Katia whispered from behind him. "Leave them alone." "We're leaving," said Jim. "And I'm sorry we used your bed." "It's not mine, it's Conrad's," said Tony. "But it's a principle of the thing." "Tony, you've got about as many principles as an eel," said Katia. "Come on, Lisa," said Jim. "Do your parents know you're screwing?" Tony asked. "Not yet," said Jim. "And I'd like it if they didn't." "Sure," said Tony. "I dig it. I don't imagine your dad would be too hot about you fucking with Jane's baby. Hey, you know, it's statutory rape. How about that?" "Go," said Katia to Jim and Lisa. "Tony, you're an ass. Statutory rape. Army desertion. I'm witnessing all sorts of crimes." "You witness a crime every time you look in the mirror," said Katia. "Goodbye, kids. I'm glad you love us." Jim and Lisa left, the shame and uncertainty that Tony had stirred not dispelled by Katia's blessing. They stopped for a drink of water in the galley and then soberly climbed the steps to the wheelhouse. Ollie was snoring on a settee while Macklin stood at the wheel, the light of a cigarette casting a brief reddish glimmer on his face. Jim was aware that Macklin had been ordered not to use up any of the cigarettes, and he automatically stopped and looked closely at him. Macklin didn't speak, simply returning Jim's gaze, then looking at Lisa, then back at Jim. Lisa left to go to her cabin with Jean. Macklin exhaled a cloud of smoke towards Jim, but the rush of air from the port entranceway blew it aft. "Have a good time?" Macklin asked. Jim returned his stare a moment longer and then walked past him and out of the wheelhouse towards his own starboard cabin. His futile rage at Tony and Macklin had him trembling. Down in the cabin, Frank was awake, staring at the ceiling. "Where have you been, Jim?" he asked. Jim went to the little sink to wash the sweat off his face. "With Lisa," he answered after a moment. "Talking." His father didn't say anything for a while. Jim wiped off his face and chest. The salt water left him sticky. "I'm glad, Jim," Frank said. "I mean, you and Lisa getting together, being friends, it's good." Jim, his back to his father, felt a wave of emotion flood him. Gratitude to his father, love for Lisa, sympathy for his father's troubles. "Thanks, Dad," he said, wiping his face and chest. "You know," said Frank, still invisible on his berth, "Jean and Lisa and Skip are really part of our family now. We've got to take care of them. Take care of them just as we would your mother and Susan." In the darkness, Jim put down the washcloth and towel on the sink and went to his narrow berth forward of Frank's. They're good people," Jim said as he climbed onto the foam mattress. "They're family," said Frank. "Lisa's your sister." Jim pulled the sheet up over his damp, sticky body and pulled off his swimming trunks. He felt a chill when his father referred to Lisa as his sister, fearful that Frank was thinking in terms of his relationship with Jean and not seeing Lisa as separate, as a woman. "Good night, Dad," he said. "All of us," Frank seemed to be saying softly, but Jim didn't know what he meant. In another minute he could hear the heavy rasp of his father's breathing as he slept. Lying in a berth beside Catchy the next morning, Jean thought about Neil and about Skippy's not eating enough, and how gaunt Frank was beginning to look, and how Neil's thighs and Skippy's fascination with fish guts, and about Lisa and Jim, and about the planet withering with the plagues unleashed by the war, and about how tired she was of dealing with it all, and about Neil. At times their voyage seemed hopeless, at other times selfish and narcissistic. Part of her felt that she ought to be suffering and dying on the mainland with the rest of the world, not falling in love. She wanted to be a nun ministering to the suffering victims of war. She wanted to be naked in Neil's arms. She wanted to devote her life to bringing up her children so the world could be created, would be free of evil that her generation had unleashed. But she wanted a house, a big double bed, and a supermarket with a restaurant next door. She wanted Frank to stop loving her and Neil never to stop. She wanted the world to stop surprising her with his ability to kill people. She wanted to die. No, she wanted to live. To live. To live. She slipped abruptly out of her berth, and though it was still 40 minutes before she was due to feed the two watch teams, she began to dress. "Hey, what's the problem?" Catcher asked her unexpectedly. "You've been tossing and turning as if you're trying to solve the whole world's problems in one long think." Resting on one elbow, Catcher was looking sleepy-eyed at Jean, who stood a few feet away, buttoning up her blouse. Catcher spoke in a low voice so as not to disturb Lisa and Skip, who were still sleeping in the adjoining berth. At 5, the light was just beginning to gather in the east. "Restless," Jean answered. "Men do have that effect, don't they?" Catchy remarked, not accepting the evasive answer. Jean stared back but didn't reply. "Frank and Neil are both coming on to you," Catchy went on, "and you're interested in Neil. What's the problem?" Jean leaned down to put on her boat shoes. Although she liked Catcher, she was not used to confiding in another woman, especially one she barely knew. "I don't think my emotional problems are worth talking about," she finally said in a low voice. "They're worth talking about if you plan keeping me awake every night thinking about them," Catcher replied. "Hey, come on. I'm exactly the person you should talk to." Jean walked softly to the forward part of the cabin to check that Lisa and Skip were asleep. When she got back, a gentle swell rolled under Vagabond, making her 3 holes tip, slide and roll with a queasy sideways motion that always made Jean feel a mild dizziness. "Have you slept with Neil?" Catcher asked after the silence continued. Unused to such bluntness, Jean didn't even turn around to face her. "If you'd like me to vacate this berth and take Skip off your hands today so you and Neil can be alone, I will," said Katya. "I mean, getting on with a lover on this boat is going to involve a major logistical effort. It's worse than a girl's dorm." Jean turned back to Katya. "You and Tony?" she asked. "Oh, me and Tony are the types that could make it in the Grand Central Station if that's what I wanted," Katya replied, smiling sleepily. She sat up and stretched, the sheet sliding off, revealing her small breasts with long nipples. Jean looked away. "It's not a problem of privacy," she said softly. "Well, tell me what it is," Katya said. "I promise to give you bad advice which you can ignore. It's a telling that will help." Jean glanced again at her sleeping children and finally, with a rush, began talking. "Oh, Katya, I love Neil, but it's no use. It can never work out. It's so mixed up. I'm fond of Frank too. We're all a family now, and I can't do anything that would go to make Frank bitter and divide us. I just can't do it." Katya, now sitting up and leaning back against the partition between her berth and Lisa and Skip's, was brushing out her curly ash-blonde hair. When Jean stopped talking, Katya frowned. "So don't sleep with either of them," Katya concluded, looking puzzled. "Most men survive, or they find someone else they can bury their sorrow and other parts of their anatomy in. She looked at Jean questioningly. Jean was depressed by this advice. It was excellent advice, but had the flaw of asking her to stay away from Neil. Or sleep with both of them, Katya went on, watching Jean carefully. No, I can't do that, Jean said simply. Katya swung out of bed again and began to dress. As she reached into the cubby to get a shot, she suddenly became irritated. You think too much, Jean, Katya said. If you and a man love each other, that's it. That's first. The rest of the world doesn't count. Family doesn't count. A woman's friend doesn't count. Grab it. She stepped into her shorts, then grabbed a yellow t-shirt and pulled it over her head, shaking her hair and brushing it down when her head emerged. Everyone else does, she added. And with Jean staring at her, she climbed the hatchway steps, slid back the hatch, and was gone.